I'm greatly excited to welcome my next guest who is joining me in studio. Christine Wormuth is Secretary of the Army. She has previously served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy during the Obama administration, and she's here today to discuss the people, the strategies, and technologies behind the Army of the future. Secretary Wormuth, it's really, really great to have you here in person. It's nice to be doing these things in person again, so thank you.
My pleasure.
Look, I want to just start out with news that's unfolding, and you know strategy, you know resources, manpower, etc. But what's unfolding in Ukraine and the terrible tragedy there, I remember when the Biden administration started off, it started off with an Asia focus. It started off with the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, having some rather, tough meetings with China and talking about the pivot to Asia. Do you think that was a mistake in the sense that it gave an opportunity to Vladimir Putin, said, hey, remember us over here in Europe?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think we still have to keep our eye on China as the pacing challenge. And I think, the United States as a leader in the international community needs to be able to walk and chew gum. So I don't think we took our eye off the ball there. And frankly, I think, Vladimir Putin went into Ukraine, obviously, in 2014. So I think there were plenty of folks who were paying attention to Russia as an acute threat as well.
Now, there are players in the world, and some of them happen to be in Russia. We saw this with what happened in the 2016 election, and others that are playing in new areas, cyber war. We've seen the weaponization of things like immigration between Belarus and Lithuania. A lot of new dimensions to conflict that were not in a traditional NATO or military playbook. And we're talking about the Army of 2030. What are the dimensions of these new hybrid dimensions of conflict that we're preparing for and thinking about? How is what we're seeing unfold in the world shaping the decisions and deployments you're making?
All of those dimensions are really core to our transformation to the Army of 2030. And our sort of centerpiece concept is called multi-domain operations, precisely because it's not just about the traditional warfighting domains of air, land, and sea. You now have space, you have cyber, you have information. And for example, one of our new formations that we're developing is called the Multi-Domain Task Force. And it is designed to be able to bring together not just the traditional kinetic effects, but also to be able to leverage information, cyber, and space.
I think 20 years ago, if you were to kind of spend some time with the Chinese literature looking at us, they were worried about our own revolution in military affairs, taking technology and information systems and equipping the soldier, creating smart systems throughout the system. So we've had 2 decades of that, and I think it's been pretty impressive when you see U.S. forces, a lot of that has been achieved. As you look out 20 years from now, and you're going to increasingly, what does a soldier look like in 2030? How has that changed?
Well, I think the soldier in 2030 is going to be sort of the middle step to a more complete transformation that will probably happen in 2040. So a lot of the equipment, what we call kit for soldiers is in 2030 is going to be similar to what they have today. But I do think you'll have things like wearable technologies, for example. So we are working on a headset called IVAS that will allow soldiers to be able to, see an environment, to operate and train in a virtual environment. So I think you'll see our soldiers using that kind of equipment. I think you'll see us leveraging data more and bringing some robotics and artificial intelligence assisted technologies to our soldiers. And then, by 2040, I think you'll see a more fundamental change.
I've had a privilege to interview many of your predecessors and colleagues in the U.S. national security space. And one of the things that I've learned is that we have to make bets about the future. We have to look at complex weapon systems today that are really going to perform into the future. Sometimes we get those bets right, sometimes we get them wrong. And some of the lament that I hear from people is that we get stuck with having to pay for things that may not be fighting the wars of tomorrow, but still a little bit yesterday. How do you navigate the North Star in that kind of dimension when you're thinking about the expenditures? I'd love to hear what you think about the budget that's just come out. Is it designed to pay off these legacy systems that are about conflicts of tomorrow, of yesterday? How do we orient it towards the conflicts of tomorrow?
Well, on the budget, I feel quite good about the budget that the Army has this year.
How much did you go for?
We've got $178 billion in our top line, and the great part about that is it's going to allow us to maintain our modernization momentum. And we are pursuing a modernization program that is a once in 40 years kind of very ambitious effort. Like you said, we're placing a lot of bets. But I think one thing that's helping us try to, make smart bets, if you will, and navigate the uncertainty of that landscape is, first of all, we're pursuing something called Project Convergence, which is really kind of an experimentation series that we have where we're using our soldiers and operating and experimenting with a lot of these new technologies to try to figure out which ones really have the most promise. And we're doing that with our sister services, with the Air Force, with the Navy, with the Marines, the Space Force. And then the second thing is we are leveraging a lot of new authorities that Congress has given us to allow us to develop and acquire new systems more rapidly. And we're really fundamentally pursuing a soldier-centric design agenda so that we are getting prototypes out into the field, letting soldiers work with them, give us feedback. And that's a very different way of developing weapon systems than the Army has pursued in the past.
I know that cyber is a huge part of what you're doing, and I always wonder, and I know this is going to be layman terms in this, I don't know how you talk about it in the military. I always worried a little bit like maybe America is running into a problem that the British had when they were fighting the colonial revolutionaries, that they're well organized, they know their doctrine, they know their units, but they were fighting, U.S. soldiers in the woods and swamps, the early colonial folks. And when I think about cyber, and I think about the folks that are the hackers, the folks that are often engaged in, perhaps it's a movie depiction, but I often wonder, do we have the environment that attracts cyber brilliance to defend this nation, to think about it, that is as creative and nimble as some of the folks I see sometimes in Eastern European shops?
Well, we are certainly trying to create that environment where we can attract the best talent. And, one of the things that we offer, obviously, in the Army and in the military is the opportunity to work with NSA, for example, where they're really getting to do some of the sexiest issues, on the cutting edge of cyber and cyber offensive and defensive operations. And our Army Cyber Command is, offering those kinds of opportunities for soldiers. But we're also, we've developed something called the Software Factory at Army Futures Command, where we're finding soldiers all across the Army who aren't necessarily, their day job in the Army isn't focused on cyber, but they happen to be terrific coders. And we have found those people and are really using them to build apps and programs for us that can be used on the battlefield. So I think that, combined with just frankly the fundamental opportunity to serve the nation and have that sense of purpose, is something that allows us to attract a lot of great talent.
Madam Secretary, I know this is a hard question, but I guess I'm going to ask you it sort of in the inverse, which is, how is the Army today in terms of dealing with people where they are, the human part of this? We see reports about sexual violence. We have seen the ups and downs, which I'm sure is very hard for those service people who are transgendered. Having had a light switch on, you're wanted at one moment, you're not wanted in the next. We've seen the stress from suicides, the fatigue in the system. And I guess after talking to a lot of U.S. senators who are concerned about reporting authority and how to get this right, so I guess it's really a human question. What are we not doing that we still need to do on the side of mental health, supporting people where they're at, and not having a large gap between military service and all of the colors and flavors that looks like in our military and the rest of our society? Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the big things that we are doing is focusing on prevention. We have done a lot, and a lot of the reforms that have happened in the last couple of years have been about, taking those kinds of crimes out of the chain of command and having them be handled by trained lawyers who are really specialists in that. And I think that's an important reform. But what we're really trying to do is focus on preventing those harmful behaviors in the first place. And part of what we're doing there is trying to make sure that our soldiers and their families have access to behavioral health resources, because that's, when it comes to things like suicide prevention, that's really key. But one of the things that we're challenged by, frankly, Steve, is the fact that our country has a shortage of behavioral health specialists at exactly the time when the demand for that nationwide, with everyone coming out of the pandemic, is at probably a historic high. But we are really trying to emphasize people first. Our units take one day a month to really have commanders focus on mental health, on prevention, on wellness with all of the soldiers. We're doing a lot to try to make sure that our soldiers and families are cared for and feel respected and safe in their workplaces.
Look, I'm going to ask you, finally, a few weeks ago, you gave what were very prescient remarks about where this Ukraine crisis was going to go. You saw it getting much, much worse. You saw Russians likely targeting civilians and hospitals, and we saw what happened with the theater in Mariupol and others. And I guess my question to you now is, as you look forward, one of the big questions that's out there is how prepared are we with a real playbook, which I think scares people to think about, if Russia were begin to go after some of the planning and supply and support in Poland? What happens if there is a tactical nuclear explosion somewhere that leads to radiation and materials coming into one of our NATO allies? I think one of the questions out there is, what's the solvency of our response? How prepared are we, and where do you think this is going?
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly think we have to prepare and plan for those kinds of possibilities. And we have a long history of planning for operating in a chemical, biological, even nuclear, environment, as terrible it is to contemplate that. So those plans are in place. Our soldiers have those kinds of equipment for those kinds of situations. But I think that's why, so much emphasis is being placed on defending every inch of NATO territory and putting a very strong deterrent posture forward. And, we've got 40,000 Army troops alone in Europe to make very clear to President Putin that there are lines that can't be crossed.
I would just say finally, I used to ask people what keeps you, keep you at night. What's the 3 a.m. call you get? Is there a night you don't get a 3 a.m. call?
Well, luckily I'm on the man, train, and equip side of the equation now, as opposed to managing the daily crises. But certainly this is probably the most dangerous security environment that I've been in 25 years of working in national security. So there's no shortage of things to keep you awake at night.
Well, Christine Wormuth, Secretary of the Army, it's such a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks for sharing your insights with us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.